Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to this evening's program. We're so happy that you decided to join us. We've got a really exciting program tonight with Cyndi Hanes. Before we turn it over to her, I've got a little bit of housekeeping just to get us started. If you did not know, Kentucky and Its Kin, which is our companion guide to the Essential Guide to Kentucky Family Research, that was published this past month. It is now available on Amazon. Wonderful book. It's a great companion to the first book. Again, like the first book, all profits from the sale of Kentucky and Its Kin are going to the Kentucky Digitization Grant Fund, which benefits all of you because it gets rare Kentucky records digitized and accessible to researchers everywhere. And I'm excited to announce this evening, I just checked a little royalties report right before tonight's program, and we have, as of today, we've just hit the $10,000 in royalties that Amazon is projecting we've sold based upon the sale of the two books so far. So please keep spreading the word. Ask for the book at your local library. Gift it to folks as you want to. And tonight we're going to give away a door prize. And tonight's door prize is going to go to whoever arrived first. And so I'm looking in here right now, and the first person who arrived, let's see here, was Debbie Carrick. Debbie, congratulations, you've won Kentucky and Its Kin. And if you are a member, we will send it to the address we've got on your membership file. If you'd like to, though, you can just enter your address in, send us a message in chat, and we will make sure that it gets out to you. It does take a couple weeks to get out. These are all printed on demand. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Melissa Barker. Oh, and again, want to welcome my wonderful co-host, Melissa Barker. Welcome, Melissa. And Elizabeth Allen Pennybaker. Welcome, Elizabeth. Melissa is with us in Tennessee Ridge, Tennessee, and Elizabeth is with us up in Burlington, Vermont, where they are under a tornado watch. So we appreciate both Melissa and Elizabeth for being with us this evening. And Melissa, feel free to take it away and introduce Cyndi.
Thank you, Chris. I appreciate it. Cyndi Hanes, a Kentucky native, has worked in the thoroughbred industry as an accountant and office manager for over 30 years. She credits her love of genealogy to her wonderful grandmother, don't we all, who gave her the genealogy bug when she was a teenager. She has been researching her family history for over 40 years, and Cyndi lives in Lexington, but often visits her son, who lives in Tennessee, where I am. Take it away, Cyndi.
Thank you, Melissa. Do you see my PowerPoint?
I do. It looks wonderful.
Okay. So in the spirit of honesty, this is the first time I've ever done one of these with a PowerPoint presentation, so hopefully we will do this correctly. So I wanted to start off tonight and tell you why I love Mammoth Cave. And part of the reason are the people in these pictures here. The older gentleman is my great-grandfather, Alan Hogan. He lived in Park City, and he used to carry the box lunches down to the Snowball dining room. Right below him is my grandmother, Eva Mae Hogan. She was the cook in the hotel. The gentleman in the chef's hat is my grandfather, Cleo Hogan, and I love that picture of him. Below him is their son, my uncle, Cleo Hogan Jr. He was a guide at the cave while he was going to college. The waitresses are ladies from the area, but the shortest one there with the dark hair is my great aunt, my grandfather's sister, Hazel Hogan Gibson. She was a waitress in the hotel. And the young girl down in the corner is me, the summer of 1976, when I worked at Mammoth Cave in the YCC program. So exactly where is Mammoth Cave located? The little star there represents it. I call it in South Central Kentucky, maybe Western Kentucky. It is located in the Edmonson, Barron, and Hart counties. The primary acreage is in Edmonson County, but it does spill over a little bit into Barron and Hart County. As you can see, it's pretty centrally located. It's pretty easy to get to Mammoth Cave for a visit. If you haven't been, I strongly encourage you to go. Exploration of Mammoth Cave began long before the European settlers. The people of the cave don't just start in the late 1700s. There's evidence that the indigenous people, the local people, were exploring Mammoth Cave thousands of years ago. This is a bundle of reeds that they found that they used as torches. Other evidence has been found in the cave, such as woven sandals, bowls, petroglyphs, and pictographs, are also evidence that early man was in the cave. There's evidence that they mined the gypsum and other minerals from the cave. Burials have been discovered in the cave, and the funerary objects found with those burials indicate an attention to detail and a respect for the dead, and also an indication by those reeds there that they were pretty experienced cave explorers. I have been on many tours of Mammoth Cave. I love the cave, and I do it with the electric lights installed. I'm not too sure about doing it with a bundle of reeds that could go out, and how are you going to restart them? But I'm sure they were smart enough to have an alternate plan. The next visitors would have been the long hunters that came into Kentucky hunting for game. Men such as William Pittman and Henry Skaggs. It's also even been suggested that maybe Daniel Boone came down as far as Mammoth Cave. They were venturing into Kentucky in the mid to late 1700s. They would have been looking for the game to hunt, but they also would have been looking for saltpeter, which they needed to make gunpowder. It's unclear, especially exactly when the cave was discovered. As I just showed you, there's evidence that there's been men in the cave for thousands of years. But for several years, this sign here was at the mouth of what's called the historic entrance, which is the other picture on this slide. And it says, discovered in 1799 by a bear hunter named Houchins, inhabited earlier by prehistoric Indians. As you can see, the historic entrance there is a pretty big entrance, and it's kind of hard to believe that maybe John Houchins found it in 1799 and nobody before him had. But I really like this story because the man pictured here is John D. Houchins, who is believed to be the man who was chasing the wounded bear. And he's my fourth great-grandfather on my father's side of the family. So I'm kind of partial to that story, and I like to believe it. In 1799, a survey by Elijah Covington gave the meters and bounds of 200 acres with the words, to the beginning, including 2 saltpeter caves. Those saltpeter caves were Dixon's Cave and Mammoth Cave. On July the 9th of 1812, the deed was recorded 3 times, probably to establish clear title, because it appears that in 1798, Valentine Simon and his wife, who are considered the first owners of the cave, bought 200 acres. And in the 200 acres that I just mentioned in that survey. In 1799, the land was sold, including the 2 caves, to John Flatt of Barron County for a whopping $116.67. Not much is known about John Flatt, just that he came from Pennsylvania and he was married to an Elizabeth Logston. Now, this is interesting, his wife being Elizabeth Logston, because Valentine Simon was married to Annie Durbin. And Annie Durbin is believed to be the daughter of John Durbin and Anne Logston. So you have the connection of the Logstons and the Durbins and the Flatts there. If you've done any research in that area, you will know that Logstons and Durbins, there's many, many of them in that area, and they're very interconnected. This slide here shows you a copy of that original recording. It says Valentine Simon enters 200 acres of, I think that says sound rate land in Warren County by return of the beginnings coming from certificate number 2428, lying on Green River, beginning on a something, and it goes on to say then including 2 Peter caves. John Flatt sold the land to George and John McLean for $400 each. So he had paid $116.67. He sells it for $800. George McLean was the son-in-law of Gregory C. Doyle, who was an early settler of the area and leaves many, many descendants. Again, I'm one of those descendants through my father's line. In 1808, George and John McLean sold 156 acres of that 200 to Fleming Gatewood and Charles Wilkins, $3,000 each. So it went from $116.67 to $6,000. Fleming Gatewood was a brother-in-law of the man who founded Bell's Tavern, and I included this slide here of Bell's Tavern because it was in Glasgow Junction, Kentucky, which is where I consider my hometown. I was born in Glasgow, but all my family lived in what is now Park City, and I have a very special fondness in my heart for Bell's Tavern. Fleming Gatewood had married Susan Slaughter, who was married to, whose sister was married to William Bell. Bell's Tavern was a very popular stopping place in Glasgow Junction, famous for its peach brandy. And when Mammoth Caves Hotel was full, the overflow would go down into Glasgow Junction and stay at the tavern. Unfortunately, it burned and it was being rebuilt. As you can see here, it's partially rebuilt when the Civil War broke out, and this is as far as they got with rebuilding it. The War of 1812 had started in June, just before these deeds were recorded, and the cave became a very valuable asset. That's why the price increased so much, because it was a source of saltpeter, which was needed for gunpowder, which was needed for the guns during the war. Before the war, gunpowder had been able to be obtained from overseas, but because of the war, those sources were not available anymore, and saltpeter soared from about 17 cents a pound during the war to 75 cents to $1 per pound during the war. In August of 1812, right after the war would have started, Fleming Gatewood sold his 50% for $10,000 to Hyman Gratz. So we've gone from $116.67 for the 200 acres to $10,000 for half of it. Hyman Gratz was from Philadelphia. He was a wealthy man. The language in the deed had including the saltpeter cave known by the name of Flats, now the Mammoth Cave. And in April of 1813, Hyman Gratz purchased the 40 acres that included the other saltpeter cave, Dixon's Cave, and brought the property together again. Dixon's Cave is very near to the historic entrance of Mammoth Cave, and they were probably one time one continuous cave, but there was what they call a breakdown where part of the cave collapsed and sealed them off from each other, and now they're considered two separate caves. Hyman was the first to develop a hotel on the property. Saltpeter was extensively mined during the war, and it is believed that extensive profits were earned. But after the war, of course, when the overseas markets for saltpeter opened back up, the cave declined in value, and in 1828, the executors of Charles Wilkins, the partner of Hyman Gratz, sold his 50% to Hyman Gratz for $200. So that shows you how much it declined in value. But Hyman employed a manager, an Irishman named Archibald Miller, and Miller began giving tours of the cave. The first commercial tour was in 1816. In 1838, the cave was purchased by a lawyer from Glasgow named Franklin Gorin. It is believed that he wanted to expand the tourism potential. He retained Archibald Miller as the manager. He enlarged the end and built fences and stables. He only owned the cave for about a year and a half, but he made his mark on Mammoth Cave history when he put one of his enslaved men named Stephen Bishop in the cave. Stephen began guiding in 1838, and when he wasn't guiding, he was exploring, and he must have been a heck of an explorer. Before he started exploring the cave, it only went into a place called Bottomless Pit. If you've ever been in the cave on what's called the historic tour, you've been across Bottomless Pit. But in 1838, they didn't know how to get across Bottomless Pit. Stephen figured out a way, and in the winter of 1838, he doubled the known length of the cave. And the owners of the cave started sending to newspapers news of his exploits and what he was finding. One of the things he discovered that is one of my favorite parts of the cave is what's called Fat Man's Misery. In 1842, he drew this map here on the screen from memory. And even though he was not an educated man, it's pretty darn accurate, and it was used up into the 1880s. It is called the Bishop Map. Stephen had married a lady named Charlotte, and they had one son, Thomas, and unfortunately, I don't know what happened to Thomas. Stephen was offered his freedom. Several of the visitors who would come to the cave would offer to buy him his freedom, but he would tell them that he was saving his money, the tips that people would give him, and he was going to buy his family's freedom himself. One of the men who offered him his freedom, who offered to help him buy his freedom, theorized in his writings that Stephen loved being in the cave and exploring because underground he felt free. Stephen was so popular a guide that his death was announced in many papers. In the Daily National Intelligencer in July 27, 1857, it appeared, "We announce today the death of Stephen, the celebrated guide of the Mammoth Cave. He is pleasantly remembered by thousands of persons in this country and all portions of the civilized world." So Stephen definitely made his mark on the cave. In 1839, the cave was sold to Dr. John Cron, and that name is Croghan. I've heard several pronunciations of it. I'm going to say Cron. Dr. Cron was a son of Major William Cron and Lucy Clark. Lucy was a sister of the famed explorer George Rogers Clark. Even though he was from Kentucky, Dr. Cron had never visited Mammoth Cave. His parents and one of his brothers had, but he hadn't. But while he was in Europe, he began to hear more and more stories of the cave and of Stephen's explorations. And when he returned to Kentucky, he visited the cave and he purchased it from Mr. Gorin, paying $10,000 for the land, the cave, the inn, and the guides. It was he who first extensively developed and exploited its commercial appeal. He expanded the hotels and began getting more roads into the property. Unfortunately, he died just 10 years later in 1849 from tuberculosis. He had never married, and he left all of the cave properties, which was over 1,600 acres of land, to trustees for his 9 nieces and nephews until the death of the last one. The last of the heirs died in California in 1926. So for over 77 years, the cave estate was controlled and operated by the trustees. As a physician, Dr. Cron, who himself suffered from tuberculosis, was interested in the cave's effect on tuberculosis patients. One visitor that he had read had written, "The air is slightly exhilarating and sustains one in a ramble of 5 or 10 hours, so that at its end he is hardly sensible of fatigue." So the doctor wanted to explore the potential of the cave air in treating tuberculosis. He had grand plans to build an elaborate hospital, but he began with 2 stone cabins and 8 simple wood structures. And the 2 stone cabins are still standing in the cave today and can be seen on tour. In the winter of 1842, 16 patients entered the cave. It's not exactly known how many men and women went into the cave. This is a list I found in the Boston Evening Transcript of July 10, 1843, listing the invalids who have resided in Mammoth Cave. But I don't feel this is a complete list because I also found a notation in the book, and I've lost my notation for where it was, My Great-Grandfather's House in Exeter, New Hampshire by James Emery Brooks, that said Elizabeth Brooks was born in 1761, married William Woodbridge, as already noted, under Phillips Academy. Here's the interesting part. Her eldest grandson, James Woodbridge Barnes, and his wife went to Mammoth Cave, Kentucky in 1842. They were both ill with tuberculosis, and it was believed that the uniform temperature in the cavern would result in a cure. The night they arrived at the hotel at the mouth of the cave, Margaret, the wife, died. A few days later, James entered the cave and stayed several months, but his mental distress caused him to return home. But he felt benefited by the rest and lived on for 8 more years. Unfortunately, Margaret was not the only person who died. At least five patients died. And after only about 5 months, it was determined that cave air was not good for tuberculosis, and all of the patients came out and the experiment was ended. When Dr. Cron died, the first trustee that was appointed was Senator Joseph Underwood, the very distinguished man here in the jacket and the vest. He had been a partner of Franklin Gorin, who had sold the cave to Dr. Cron and was a cousin of Dr. Cron. He managed the cave for about 20 years until he resigned in 1869. After his resignation, members of the immediate family and others acted as trustees of the property until 1900, when Albert J. Janin, the husband of Violet Blair, who was one of the heirs, assumed sole management and control. Mr. Janin was a native of Louisiana and a lawyer, and was a gentleman of culture. His effect on the cave is generally considered to be positive, especially in his early years. And I read in one book that it's remarkable because he had not been very successful up until he took over management of the cave. But he began to keep detailed records. Under his management, the hotel made money, which it had rarely done before. It seemed he had a knack for promotion and marketing, and he designed numerous advertising materials. Under his care, the electric lights were installed in the cave and in the hotel. His later years, unfortunately, were marred by the increased competition from other local caves, other local hotels, and his failing health, and he died in 1928. If you're interested, there is a book about the marriage of Violet and Albert called Love and Power in the 19th Century by Virginia Jeans Loss. I have not read the book, but I have seen excerpts from it, and it seems very interesting. After he died, there had been talk for many years about trying to make Mammoth Cave a national park. It had first been mentioned in 1911, but it didn't take over and go anywhere. But in May of 1924, a meeting of citizens interested in the creation of Mammoth Cave National Park was held at the Helm Hotel in Bowling Green, Kentucky. A second meeting was held in October of that same year and resulted in the formation of the Mammoth Cave National Park Association. On May 25, 1926, President Calvin Coolidge signed into legislation enabling the creation of a national park at Mammoth Cave. The legislation required the acquisition of a minimum amount of acres to include the major caves. It also authorized the association as a fundraising agency for land purchases. But some landowners were not too anxious to sell, and in 1928, the Kentucky General Assembly created the Kentucky National Park Commission with the power of eminent domain to acquire lands for the park. In 1929, the Great Depression hit, and this slowed efforts to create the park. So for over 10 years, the association worked to acquire the land needed for the park. In 1941, after acquiring 48,000 acres from about 600 landowners, the U.S. Congress established Mammoth Cave as the country's 26th national park, and the park was dedicated in September of 1946 after World War II was over. Over the years, other caves and land have been acquired, and today the park comprises approximately 58,000 acres of land in Barron, Edmonson, and Hart counties, and over 400 miles has been mapped of the cave, making it the longest cave in the world. It's definitely a national treasure. It's definitely a place you want to see. And if you think you're claustrophobic and you don't want to go into the cave, you can look at the different tours that are offered. Parts of Mammoth Cave are so huge that you would not feel claustrophobic at all. But let's talk about the landowners, those 600 owners who gave up their land to make a national park. Some of the landowners didn't live on the land. There were tenants or sharecroppers who had farmed the land for the owners. it's approximated that of the 600 families comprised approximately 2,000 people. As you can imagine, some of the sales was voluntary and some the eminent domain had to be used. I've never read any research on this, but just from talking to people as I've been growing up in the area, my impression is the young people were anxious to sell and move out into the large cities or the near cities. I don't know that you could call Park City or Cave City a large city, but the older people were the ones who didn't want to give up their land. When the park movement began, agents had been appointed to contact the various owners about selling their land. In 1933, the CCC was established, and there were 4 CCC camps at Mammoth Cave. In a 1987 interview for a history project at Western Kentucky University, a man named Vernon Wells was interviewed about his participation in the CCC project. And he's a very interesting man to read his interview because he became the first park ranger of Mammoth Cave. And he told the story about how those 2 original agents would go and talk to these landowners and would tell them that, yeah, you can sell your land and you're not going to have to move for a long time, maybe not even before you die. You'll get to live out your years here. But of course, those were promises they couldn't make. They were what are called gentlemen's agreements. They were handshakes, never written down on paper. So when Vernon began at the CCC, he was assigned to a man named Robert Holland. Mr. Holland had been sent to Mammoth Cave to represent the National Park Service, and his assignment was to expedite in every way possible the establishment of the park. So he assigned Vernon and another man named Joseph Ridge the job of walking the parkland that they wanted to buy, to learn the topography and to identify all of the land and people who were living on it. If you've ever been to Mammoth Cave, and you can tell a little bit from these 2 pictures, it is very hilly. And they were walking this land, trying to find all of the owners and the people who lived on it. I'm sure it was not easy work, especially on those days when it rained and it was muddy, because there weren't paved roads in the cave at that point. But he said eventually they figured it out. They got a handle on the topography and the people who lived there. When his tour with the CCC was over, him and Joseph were hired as the first park rangers, and their jobs then began to be get the people off the land. Those people who had been told, you're not going to have to move for years and years, didn't want to move. Their first job was in the summer of 1934. Mr. Holland gave them the task of informing all the people in the cave that they were going to have to vacate their land. Guess what? Nobody moved, or he didn't think anybody moved. One story that he remembered and told in his interview was of a gentleman that he had ran into one day while he was in the cave in the land working, making his list and exploring. The gentleman told him that he had been told he wasn't going to have to leave the cave and he wasn't going to leave the property. Mr. Wells, Vernon, went back and told Mr. Holland about this encounter with the guy. And Mr. Holland decided that he was going to be the first one that they made an example of. And he sent him a 20-day letter. A 20-day letter was a letter that was sent to the resident and it said he had 20 days to leave the property voluntarily or he would be forcibly removed. At the end of the 20 days, the gentleman hadn't left. So Mr. Holland and the 2 rangers armed themselves with handguns, axes, crowbars, and sledgehammers and set off. When they got to the property, they gave the resident one last chance to leave. He said he wasn't going anywhere. And so they literally started taking the house down around his ears. They crawled up and started removing the shingles and the tin from the roof. They started knocking down the walls. And eventually the gentleman realized he was going to have to leave and the cabin was uninhabitable. This is just one of many stories of what happened as they were clearing the land. In other cases, The rangers would watch the property, and if the resident left, they would go in and demolish the building while he was gone, so that the resident came back home to nothing but a pile of rubble. An article that I found in the Axe and Sledge, which was a CCC newspaper in January of 1936, says work will begin immediately to remove the last 20 families from the Mammoth Cave Park area, a move necessary before the National Park Service assumes jurisdiction of the tract. It was announced last week, following a joint meeting of the Kentucky National Park Commission and the Mammoth Cave National Park Association at the Brown Hotel. Necessary steps to effect the evacuation will begin as soon as Attorney General B.M. Vincent assumes office, it was stated. Originally, some 700 families lived in the area. We now know the 700 was a little bit of an overstatement, but that's how the residents were removed from the cave. And this is what was left. The pile of rocks is the George and Ida Dennison home site. And this cemetery is one of the Dennison cemeteries. There's many Dennisons in the Mammoth Cave area, and I don't remember which one this is, but this is one of the Dennison cemeteries, and it's both of these pictures are very indicative of what you will find if you go out into the wild of Mammoth Cave today, because not only 3 churches were the only buildings that were left standing. Before I go on, I know some of you are going to say, and this is a newspaper from where it became a national park. Some of you are going to say, wow, that's a lot of history in a short amount of time. And it is. The first 3 deeds that I talked about at the beginning were recorded 211 years and 4 days ago. That's a lot of history that I can't cover in an hour. And I wanted to talk a little bit about some other things besides the history of the cave. So I hope I've given you a little synopsis of it and maybe piqued your interest. Some of you who may know about the cave may be saying, you left out some of the best parts. What about the stagecoach robbery? In 1880, it is documented that Jesse James took a cave tour one day and then robbed the Mammoth Cave stagecoach the next day. One story that I read said that one of the gentlemen on the stagecoach was a judge. I believe his last name was Roundtree, and he had a pocket watch stolen. And when Jesse James was shot down and murdered, that pocket watch was still found on Jesse James. Maybe you're asking, what about the dummy train? If you've ever been to Mammoth Cave, you've seen this train. It sits on the property. This is one of them. I believe there were 4 total. Mammoth Cave had a railroad for over 45 years, from 1886 to 1931. There was a 9-mile track of railroad track that connected Park City to Mammoth Cave. The L&N Railroad would bring the tourists and the visitors to Park City, Glasgow Junction, and they would board this dummy train and be taken out to Mammoth Cave. It's called a dummy train because it was boxed up to look like a passenger streetcar. What about the cave wars? This is pretty interesting. And I was talking to a girl here at work today about the cave wars. There was such things called cappers. And a capper was somebody who would induce the visitors to, they would stand along the side of the road and try and induce the visitors to visit their private cave instead of going to Mammoth Cave. And she said, oh, they're like those people who stand outside and spin signs today. And I hadn't thought about it, but I'm like, yeah, you're right. They were the early sign spinners. Mammoth Cave was kind of quite a ways out from Park City and Cave City, the 2 main towns that you would go to get to the cave. And lots of people wanted to find their own private cave to get in on a little bit of the business. If you remember, I said that the last years of Mr. Jannon's management was marred by competition from local caves and other hotels. That's because everybody who could find a cave on their property wanted to develop it and try and get some of the tourists to come to their cave. The big sign there was along the road to Mammoth Cave, and it's kind of hard to read in that picture, but it says, caution to tourists. If you want to see the original and only Mammoth Cave, do not be misled by a new entrance. these cappers would stand along the side of the road and try and tell these tourists that, oh, well, I've got a cave and it's actually a different entrance. You'll be in Mammoth Cave, but you're not going to go to the actual Mammoth Cave. I've also heard stories of visitors being told the cave was closed, that the cave was quarantined because of a disease, that the cave had caved in or had flooded. These cappers would do whatever they could to get the visitors to come to their cave and get those tourist dollars before they got all the way to Mammoth Cave. This article here is an article I found about Kentucky cavemen revert to war for tourist business. The middle section there says, competition among the operators of the various noted caverns of Kentucky for the tourist trade has become so keen that property is being destroyed, according to evidence in the case of Collins, who was tried for destroying signs of rival cavemen along the Dixie Highway. The Collins mentioned here is Andy Collins, who was a brother of Floyd Collins, and some of you may have heard of Floyd Collins. He was trapped in Sand Cave in 1925, and before they could get him out of the cave, he unfortunately died in the cave. But it became a national story. My great-grandmother lived along the road out to Sand Cave, and she used to tell me about seeing all the people who went out the road to see what was going on out at Sand Cave. If you Google, there's all kinds of books and all kinds of newspaper articles you can find about Floyd Collins. A book named Trapped was written about his plight. It's a sad story, but it's a part of the history of the cave. You might also be asking, well, what about going to the fourth? What is going to the fourth? Well, it's kind of a reunion, only they didn't call it a reunion. They called it a homecoming. After the people were removed from the land, they got together, and every 4th of July, they would go back to Mammoth Cave for what they called homecoming. And they called it going to the fourth. If you talk to anybody in the area and said, are you going to the fourth? They all knew what you meant. This was a chance for the landowners who had been moved off the land to come back and to see their neighbors, the people that they had known all their life. There was singing and food and dancing and preaching, and it was a big occasion that everybody wanted to go to. As I said, I can't do a complete history in the time I have, and I want to spend the rest of the time I have, hopefully, talking to you a little bit about the people of the cave. As early as 1779, a man named John Swadden Sanders and his brothers were settling in Edmonson County. I could tell you about the Sanders. I could tell you about the Lindsays, the Merediths, the Webbs, or the Lees. A man named Kenneth Lee wrote 3 books about the cave area. Another look at Jacob's people from the Silent Grove and near Elko, all good research material if you're interested in the people. But I want to talk to you, when I was trying to figure out how in the heck do I weed down 600 families into a few that I could tell you about, I remembered a newspaper article that appeared in the Park City Daily News, which, if you don't know, is the Bowling Green newspaper, or that's what they used to call the Bowling Green newspaper. It was in June of 1938, and it was an article about families who had sons on guide duty at the cave, and the reach, the deepness they went into the cave, to their generations. I found this page here in the 1940 census of Edmonson County, and I think it's kind of indicative of how important the cave was to the local people. If you look at this page, I think it's 7 of the main people on this page, the breadwinners, as you will, were somehow associated with the cave or the cave area. So we could talk about Roy Bransford, who was a bellhop at the hotel, and I am going to talk about Bransford here in a few minutes. Or we have Taylor Haskins, who was a chief park ranger at the national park, and I have stories of him and my grandfather doing things together. Thomas Nelson was a landscape architect for the CCC at the national park, and he was a great historian for the area. The Simmons man, I think that's Taylor Simmons, was a senior clerk at the CCC National Park. And there at the bottom, John Burlington was a guide at a private cave. Note that it says private cave. That was one of them that was in competition with Mammoth Cave for the tourist dollars. But in talking about those 7 families, or maybe 8, I don't remember now, who have deep connections to the cave, I wanted to talk about first this man here, Joe McDaniel. His first associations with the cave began in 1883, when just 13 years old, he went to work as a bellhop in the hotel. He had been associated, at one point, he was considered the oldest living cave worker. And when the article was published in 1938, he was still working at the cave. From 1919 to 1949, he was the official photographer of Mammoth Cave. Some of you may have pictures like this one here. You used to could, as you went down into the cave, they would gather you in a group, and you can see the sign there that says you're at the Mammoth Cave, and take a group picture. Joe would take the picture, and then he would rush up the hill. And if you've ever been to Mammoth Cave, that's a pretty good little hill to rush up to where he had a photo studio, and he would develop the picture so that when the cave visitors came out, they could get the picture. It is estimated that as many as 1 million visitors have taken home photos that he took. When the article was published in 1938, he was working with his son, Ross, still taking photos at the entrance. Another son, Paul, was a guide at the cave. A nephew, Clifton, was a bus driver. And 2 of his other sons worked at the cave in trail maintenance and park maintenance. The Hunts and the Hansons, pictured here. Young Hunt, his brother Leo, Uncle Charles, and 3 cousins were all connected to the cave in 1938. In the older picture here of the 5 gentlemen, the man on the end with the tam hat on, I guess you'd call that a tam hat, that is Young and Leo's father, Schuyler Hunt. He had been a guide at the cave also. Their ancestor, Smithy Hunt, had arrived from Virginia in 1840. And the Hunt family can trace their connections all the way back to Archibald Miller, the manager who was first put into place by Hyman Gratz when he had the property. In 1938, these 4 men here pictured in front of the wall, Leo and Claude Hunt, along with Carl and Peter Hansen, found what is called new discovery. It was a huge new trunk. You can see how big it is there, of cave that had not been discovered before, and was covered in large yet very delicate gypsum deposits. When my grandmother was working at the cave as a cook, they offered to take some of the cave employees in to see New Discovery one night, and she went on the tour. And she used to tell me that it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen, and that some of it was so delicate that if you just breathed, you could see the gypsum moving. That's why it's not offered as a public tour, because it's too precious a resource to take a chance of ruining. The Hansen boys, Carl and Pete, were sons of Peter Hansen, who had came from Sweden. He was a carpenter, and he left his mark with his carpentry skills at the cave, both above the surface and below the surface. And these 2 sons became explorers and guides, along with a grandson, Coy Hansen. The gentleman here dressed to go into the cave is Owen Wilson. 3 members of the Wilson family, I believe they're all his sons, were guides at the cave. Buell and Siepert, their uncle Lloyd. When he died in 1928, his obituary said, Mr. O.J. Wilson, for 42 years, a guide at Mammoth Cave, died Monday night at his home at the cave. He was one of the best and most known guides who ever guided in Mammoth Cave, and his memory lingers in the hearts of many who have accompanied him. These are the men who were making their mark on the cave. The other gentleman in the picture there was Schuyler Hunt, are left to right, Much Hunter, Bob Lively, Will Bransford, Matt Bransford, and then Schuyler Hunt. All these men I could talk to you about their contributions to the cave and their families' connections. The Furlong brothers, Arthur, Leo, and Fred is pictured kneeling they're the older gentlemen. They were guides also. Their paternal grandfather, Francis Charlet, had settled in Louisville after arriving from France, but he ended up in a community in the parkland called Chaumont. Their uncle, Martin Leo Charlet, called Marty by local people, served as chief supervisor of tourist guides until 1956. And this is him pictured here with the lantern, and it says, "This is the way Martin Charlet looked in 1940 when he was manager of Mammoth Cave before it became a national park." Their paternal grandfather was a man named Hubbard or Hub Furlong. He had came from Virginia and settled on a farm in the Mammoth Cave area, but like so many others, the cave intrigued him and he became a guide and explorer. And I found what I thought was a funny little story about the Furlongs. Hub had a farm and he wanted, like all the others I've told you about, to develop his own cave. So he found an opening and they came upon a large chamber that could be made into a cave they could take people in to see. But the opening was pretty small. They were going to have to expand it before they could take people into it. So he sent his son David into the cave with pickaxes and tools, and some friends went with them to try and enlarge the opening. And they worked hard, and it was so huge that their lights could not disclose the fullness of the opening. So they worked. When they went home one night, they came back the next morning, and unfortunately, during the night, the cave had fallen and closed up all the hard work they had done and trapped their tools. And this was too much for David, who returned to the farm and vowed that he would never work in the cave again. But as I told you, 3 of his grandsons, Arthur, Leo, and Fred, did become guides. They caught his caving bug and worked in the cave. The other gentleman here in the picture, the more recent photo, is Jerry Bransford. The Bransfords have a very deep and long connection to the cave. In 1938, when the article was published that I used for my reference here, it said 4 generations of Bransford men had served as guides and explorers. This gentleman is Jerry Bransford, and I think he's either the 5th or 6th generation, and he still works at Mammoth Cave today. Their ancestor, Matt Bransford, was the son of a woman and her enslaver, a man named Thomas Bransford. In 1838, Matt was leased to Franklin Gorin, the gentleman who sold the property to Dr. Cron, and he began giving cave tours, and he spent more than 43 years in the cave. Even after he was emancipated, he gave tours into his 70s. And if you remember, that first person on the census page was a man named Roy Bransford, who was a bellhop at the hotel. And in 1907, William Bransford and some other explorers discovered the cathedral domes. So the Bransfords have a very long history with the cave. Newton, France, the France family is another family with deep connections to the cave. Newton himself was a guide, and in 1938 was still occasionally guiding. And 2 of his sons, Ray and Willie, were guides. This is the 3 churches that I told you about that are still standing: Good Spring, Mammoth Cave Baptist Church, and Joppa Church. I hope that as I've talked to you tonight, you've begun to think about the people who worshiped in these churches, who lived near here, probably walked to these churches when there were services going on. They lived off the land, and they were, for the most part, good, hardworking people. They had lived, loved, worked, been born, and died on this land before they had to leave it. And many of the people in the area today outside of the parkland, like myself, can connect to many of the people who had to leave the land. This is a map often called the Whittle map because it was drawn by Charles Whittle, a lawyer from Edmonson County. I couldn't get it to where you could read, but all the little names there are the people that he identified who had to leave the cave. So in conclusion, I would like to say to you that Mammoth Cave is one of the world's great wonders. I strongly encourage you to go visit, to take the tours, to hike the trails. The old railroad track is now a biking and hiking trail that you can enjoy. Millions of visitors have come to the cave to explore its depth. Some of them famous, like the Swedish Nightingale Jenny Lind, or Edwin Booth, the older brother of the man who killed Abraham Lincoln. He has a feature in the cave named after him, Booth's Amphitheater. But I hope that you will remember that more than just a beautiful cave and wonderful land, it was once the home to over 2,000 people who lived, loved, worshiped, and called it home. And that concludes my program tonight. I very much appreciate your coming. And if you have any questions, I'm not an expert, but I will try and answer.
Cyndi, excellent job. One of the best presentations we've had here in a long time. So thank you so much for pulling all this together. You did an exceptional job. Great job.
Thank you.
Yes, and for folks who have questions for Cyndi, please don't be shy. Enter your questions in the questions box on GoToWebinar. You should see on the screen a little place where you can do that. We'll get to some questions. And while we're waiting for questions, Cyndi, I just wanted to share, I have Loxtons and Durbins from Sunfish married into my Cundiff line down in Edmonson County. So when you said those two surnames, I was like, I am very familiar with those names.
Yes, and have you seen the book? There is a book, is it called History of Sunfish or Sunfish? I can't remember the name of it now, but it has Sunfish in the title, and it is an excellent resource for Loxtons and Durbins, and I believe it is now online, that is in public domain, and you can find that book online.
That's great. Yeah, I helped a young cousin of mine who was trying to identify his parents a few years ago, and it turned out that he was a descendant of a Durbin and a Loxton. So when you said those names, I was like, I am very familiar with those folks.
Yeah. Can I just say, Chris, I forgot to say, I wanted to mention a few of the sources that I used. Mostly this is all my own research from Googling and newspapers and books, but a couple of really good resources are Mammoth Cave, Forgotten Stories of Its People by Norman Warnell, Photographers of the Mammoth Cave Region by Bob Thompson, The Longest Cave by Roger Brucker and Richard Watson, and Edmonson County Flashlights and Folklore by Charles Whittle, the man who drew the map I showed. The interview with Vernon Wells regarding the CCC, you can find that just by Googling Vernon Wells and Mammoth Cave. And on YouTube, there is a video called A Mammoth Cave, A Place to Call Home, that made me cry, but of course I love Mammoth Cave. But it's a very good video if you're interested in Mammoth Cave.
And so in terms of if folks were looking for, like outside of those resources, if folks were looking for information, would they be able to get, I guess, from NARA or National Park Service, would they have additional information on, do you think they would have information on like land acquisitions or, things like that, or do you know?
Yes, you can contact, and gosh, I should have wrote the lady's name down. There is a lady in the Kentucky government who is excellent to help you with land records for any part of Kentucky. The Park Service did have an archives. I've not been there in several years, but I'm assuming it's still there. Their website has a ton of information. The National Park Service website, if you Google Mammoth Cave, you can find good pictures and information on their website about, obviously about the history of the cave, but also about some of the people. If you go to newspapers.com and just Google Mammoth Cave, thousands and thousands of results come up, and just Googling or Googling Google Books will also get you some really good information and resources.
So we've got several accolades coming in for Cyndi. Let's get to some of the questions. Laura wanted to share that she too had a picture of her dad from his tour group. And I'm guessing this is going back to the photographer you mentioned, Cyndi, around 1940.
Yeah, that would be Mr. McDaniel.
Trisha Anderud asked, do you know if there is an employee list of those who worked in the cave?
There's not a complete list because there's so many. You can Google and find some list, and if you want to email me, I would be glad to give you some information that I have. But as far as the complete list, no, there's not, because there's, like I said, 211 years of history there. There's just not a good complete list.
Angela Ritter asked, where can you find the CCC newspapers for this area?
Oh gosh, I should have put that in the presentation. Angela, Google Cyndi Hanes and you'll find me in my email. Email me and I'll send you the link. There's more than just that one that I found. I think there's several issues that were out there, and I'll be glad to share that link if you'll just contact me.
If anyone else has any other questions, while we're waiting, Cyndi, I just want to mention I had the privilege right before the pandemic hit to meet Jerry Bransford. And,
good.
Yeah,
he's an interesting character, isn't he?
Yeah, we have a member of the society. Her name is Deborah Smoot Middleton, and Deborah and Jerry are both they're connected in through the enslaved that you mentioned through Locust Grove in
Yes.
Louisville, which was owned by the Crons.
Yes.
But he is, he's a storyteller, and he's a legend himself. Just listening to him talk about Mammoth Cave, it's, the people who've worked here and lived there, they're passionate about this. This isn't just it's not a job. It's like, it's their identity. It's part of who they are. And you really, I think, brought that forward tonight just through your, what you shared and the stories that you shared. They've been really, really good. You kind of made it very personal, very real. So, okay, anybody else have any other questions for Cyndi? Okay, well, Cyndi, thank you so much. Anything you want to share before we wrap up with a little bit of housekeeping?
I just want to say I love Mammoth Cave. When I was a little girl, my grandmother cooked in the cave, and my parents would take me to visit her, and she would set me up on the counter of the cave in the kitchen there and feed me these little tiny biscuits that were about the size of a silver dollar. And it's one of my favorite memories. And I think my love of the cave started that day she was feeding me biscuits in the Mammoth Cave kitchen. And I just love it. I've been doing research for many, many years. This was not hard for me to put together because I already had almost all this information.
That's wonderful. And I just want to echo what Cyndi said. If you've not been to Mammoth Cave, you need to go at some point in your life. So make sure it's on your list. Okay, just a little bit of housekeeping before we wrap up. And thank you again, Cyndi, for an excellent presentation. Let's see here. If you haven't registered yet, you want to make sure you register for Ari Wilkins. She'll be doing 2 presentations in late July. One is called Incorporating Oral History into Your Research. And this is probably one of the most foundational things you can do as a researcher. So I think oftentimes folks devalue oral history, but learning how to do that really well is so important. And there's so many stories that are just sitting there in plain sight. You've just got to ask people for them. So please, if you haven't already, register for Ari Wilkins' presentation. Ari is a really excellent presenter. She's a genealogist at the Dallas, Texas Public Library. She's going to be doing that presentation for us on the 17th. She's also going to be doing a presentation for us that next week on the 24th called Mysterious Relatives. And this is how you can learn more about your family through understanding their fan club and people and names that you can find around your family. So please, I encourage you to register for both those presentations. Those are live presentations. They are not being recorded. So if you would like to participate in Ari's presentations, you have to be on them live. So you are forewarned. Finally, our 50th annual August series comes up in August. This is a wonderful opportunity for you to learn about researching your Kentucky ancestors that came from somewhere else and went somewhere else. So the title is Kentucky Daughter of the East, Mother of the West. We've invited kind of the best and the brightest from states, both before they came to Kentucky and states after they came to Kentucky. And so hopefully you have already registered for this. I want to encourage you to spread the word. It's a real great value. You get a whole series of presentations. I believe there's a total of 10 for $30 if you're a member. And if you're a non-member, you should join, and then you can participate at the member rate of $30 and save $50. So registration is now open for that. Please do your part, help spread the word, share with folks the August series, which is coming up in August. In September, we're doing something new, which is a 5-part course called Becoming a Genealogist and Family Historian, and that's with Susan Court. Susan's an excellent genealogist. Like Cyndi, she's a member of our board of directors. She's going to be teaching this 5-part course throughout the month of September. It meets every Friday in the afternoon. This course will be recorded. It is open and available to the public, so you don't even have to be a member. This is a great opportunity for folks who are new beginners to research, or folks who maybe are self-taught and would like to be able to fill in the gaps with someone who's been researching for many decades, has many published books. Susan's just a wealth of knowledge on genealogical research. So please use this as an opportunity. If you've got cousins, siblings, friends that have been talking to you about maybe getting involved in learning their family history, point them to this free course in September. It's a great opportunity for them to learn about how to begin doing genealogy, and Susan's just going to do a phenomenal job. We need volunteers. This organization operates through the kindness of many volunteers. Tonight, you heard from Cyndi. She's one of our volunteers. She's our treasurer. Melissa Barker, also one of our volunteers. Elizabeth Ellen Pennybaker, who's in Burlington, Vermont. She's one of our volunteers. I'm a volunteer. And so we need you to volunteer and help with this society. It is sustained through the kindness of volunteers. You probably have some skills that we can put to work, and we need you. So please don't take the society for granted. There's a small cadre of folks who kind of keep it going, and we need help. So please go to kygs.org/volunteer if you want to see the organization keep going and thriving and growing. And you can also email me at president@kygs.org, and we will find something for you to do based upon the time commitment you're able to commit. You can volunteer for an hour a month. You can volunteer for multiple hours a day. It really is depending upon what time commitment you want to make, what skills you want to offer. Everyone has gifts and talents that we can put to use, and we need your help. So please volunteer. And we love new members. So if you know of someone who you think might be a good member of the society, please encourage them to join. You know, we don't have an advertising budget. Our advertising is you, our membership, who helps spread the word. So please do your part and be an ambassador for the society and share it with other folks. We think we've got a really strong value here. It's $20 a year annual membership. I challenge you to find an organization like this out there that you can belong to and get such good insights and experiences from for $20 a year. So please do your part, encourage others to join the society. And with that, I want to thank Cyndi Hanes, Melissa Barker, and Elizabeth Ellen Pennybaker. And this is Christopher Paget. I'm the president of the society, and I'm signing off for this evening. Thanks, everyone, and take care. Bye-bye.